In a bustling quarter of Lahore, Amina, a soft-spoken schoolteacher with a wounded past, holds an unspoken prayer inside her chest for a future that seems to slip away every morning. When her younger brother Faraz, a driven but restless taxi driver, is drawn into a risky partnership with a charismatic developer promising quick money and social rise, their fragile family balance begins to fracture. Caught between material hunger and spiritual emptiness, Faraz hurts the only anchor Amina has, their aging father, Nasir, a quiet man who carries a secret that could redeem or destroy them. Imam Suleiman, the neighborhood's gentle spiritual elder, watches the siblings' slow unraveling and threads them back toward each other. With a powerful, simple act, a shared dua played at an evening gathering that becomes a mirror, a reckoning, and a balm. Through loss, confession, and a pilgrimage of sorts to the heart, each character must risk everything to answer an inner calling. The story explores faith beyond rituals, prayer as action, longing as fuel for courage, and the idea that when we ask God for help, sometimes the answer comes as people who become the hands of the divine. The monsoon that year came late and furious, sweeping down from the horizon like an apology. Rain hammered the corrugated roofs, rose and blew smoke from the pavement where tucks and rickshaws splashed through puddles and left the alleys smelling of wet clay and jasmine. In the small house on Myanmar Road, Amina stood with both palms pressed against the cool glass of a window and watched the rain blur the city into a watercolor of lights. The glass pressed into the soft skin of her fingertips as if the world beyond were a picture she could touch and reshape. She had a ledger under her arm, the one from the school where she taught second grade. Her fingers, quick and patient with ink, had a habit of finding the margin and doodling tiny stars when her mind drifted. That morning the stars were unfinished prayers. There was a list at the top of the ledger: rent, electricity, supplies, tuition assistance for a child named Hamid, whose mother had fainted at the school gate last week. Amina closed the ledger and drew a slow breath. The numbers were a tide she learned to ride, but lately they had the feel of something that might break its banks. Her father, Nasir, sat on a charpoy under the eaves, the wet of the rain darkening his kurta where the water clung. He looked smaller when the rain hit the air like that, as if weather could press the years into him. He whistled softly, the same note he had whistled while teaching her how to braid, while making paradas, while hiding in the night to smoke and staring at the stars, as if each inhale could pull him closer to an answer never found. His hands had tobacco stains and little scars from a life of fixing clocks and cupboards. Nasir had eyes that watched people, as if reading their margins. "Tea?" Amina asked, though she knew the answer. He always said no in the mornings, saving his appetite for an afternoon cup and the transfixing rhythm of the neighborhood conversations that drifted up the lane like prayer flags. Faraz slung his jacket over his shoulder, boots still damp from standing in the rain while listening to a man in a suit pitch him through a phone, promising maps to a different life. Faraz was 27, restless, with a jaw that kept trying to hold opinions in. He had a laugh that could portion joy like bread, and a temper that could scorch the air. Driving a taxi had been honest work until the city made it a gladiator pit: permits, bribes, fares that disappeared into apps with no gratitude. The man on the phone had a tablet and a voice that smelled of promises. "Short term," he'd said. "Big returns." His suit had been the color of polished promises. Faraz liked polished things when he could not afford them. They felt like a rumor of the man he wanted to be. "You'll be late," Amina said. She had the soft firmness of someone who had learned to urge things to their right ends. "There's a meeting tonight, remember. And the rent?" "I'll be fine, B." Faraz answered with the lopsided charm that could half mollify their father and fully taunt the world. He kissed Amina on the temple, a quick, warm press, and left. The door shut with a finality that was louder inside than outside. Amina turned to the ledger again, and to the window, where hands in the glass could no longer change anything. She had a habit of collecting du'as in her head, little conversations she made with God when the day felt too heavy. Not the ornate supplications her grandmother used to whisper with eyes closed. No. Her du'as were honest, half-broken sentences. Protect Faraz tonight. Give a smile to Hamid's mother. Send someone who will take a job with her, not because she's invisible but because she is good. She folded those prayers into her chest like paper cranes and told herself they would fly. The city had a rhythm of its own faith. The mosque next door sang adhan like a familiar chord, and a small shop across the street sold white caps that smelled of incense. Life there moved with a mixture of bargaining and grace. It was here that Imam Suleiman had his small masjid and a quiet authority that was born of listening. He had a voice that could melt concrete. People came to him when grief needed a place to be believed. He knew more du'as than there were leaves on the trees outside his masjid, but what he taught was not the exacting art of words. He taught presence, how to make a prayer feel like a living thing, by showing up for it. On an evening when the sky left its rain on the windows and Faraz came home with a new phone and a small flare of money burning his pockets, Amina noticed the dissonance first. Faraz slumped at the table, eyes brighter than before, voice heavy with the excitement of someone who had glimpsed the edge of something spectacular. "Well, met someone," he said. He pulled a small envelope from his jacket as if it were an apology. "He'll get us in. Quick work, B. Just a few rides, mostly transfers. He says there's a market, airport clients, corporate. We could get a commission. No begging, no waiting." Amina counted the risks as if they were beads. She loved Faraz's hunger for dignity, but hunger became a razor when fed by the wrong hands. She thought of their father's chest, the slow rise and fall of a man who had never left his price in the world. "And what does he want in return?" she asked. "Only that we be discreet, that we not ask questions." Faraz frowned out of habit when money smelled like compromise. Nasir, who had been listening from the corner where he mended a dented kettle, closed his eyes and said nothing. His silence was a prayer, too. Faraz took the envelope to pay a bill, and that night the city took him in a different way. He drove a gleaming SUV for the first time, Chauffeur's cap on his head like armor. People in ties folded their words around him and tipped with fingers that could not remember a hard day. The money felt like a flood. For the first time since their mother's funeral, 9 years ago, soft as a coin pressed into his palm, Faraz looked up and saw possibility in the ceiling. But roads are mirrors. What you steer toward can also be what you collide with. The man who offered the rides was named Javid, a man whose laugh had the elasticity of someone who had learned to hide sharpness behind politeness. Javid's office smelled of expensive tea and contracts. He liked Faraz's blunt honesty, which was more scarce than honesty in that city. Javid had ways of making small things seem enormous. He sold protection to shopkeepers, arranged routes, found shortcuts that sometimes dipped into the gray. His charm had the practiced ease of a man who had replaced regret with ledger entries. "You'll move fast," Javid said the night he offered Faraz a steak. "We'll get you in 5 drivers at first. If you keep your head, the next month will look like a new life." Faraz went home each night with more money and less sleep. He brought back stories, parcels, an occasional paper bag of biryani cut, with the kind of spice that tugged at Amina's memory and reminded her of summers with their mother. He bought Amina a matching set of bangles, thin gold threads that circled her wrist in a fit of impossible tenderness. "So you'll have something pretty when the children grow up and steal your heart," he said. Amina felt a guilt that tasted of metal, because the bangles were a luxury they had not allowed themselves. At the school, the children lined up, and their squeals shaped the day into something bearable. Amina taught them the alphabet and the small holiness of patience. Her classroom had a window with a vine that breathed in the daylight and dropped out a leaf now and then onto the floor. She would tilt her head and let the children see the world in letters, her voice a steady compass. They loved her quiet more than they loved the loud teachers because she let them think like small kings and queens. One child, Fatima, asked questions like a storm. Another, Hamid, who wore his blazer a size too big, had eyes that were always searching for an anchor. Hamid's mother had been ill with a fever that clung like a stubborn song. The assistance Amina offered was the difference between warmth and cold for him. Amina's dua for Hamid was a stitched seam. Not too showy, but necessary. Everything started to bend the night Faraz didn't return. He had told Amina he'd be one of the last drivers at the airport. An easy fare, a big tip. The phone went to voicemail, and for 2 hours the house held its breath. Amina felt that stillness like a hand on her throat. Nasir went to sleep with the radio on, and the rain started again, as if the city could only cry in cycles. Around midnight, a neighbor's shout drew them all onto the street. A crowd gathered at the corner, a cluster of voices like a flock. Someone said, there had been an accident on the ring road. An SUV had missed a turn and crushed a barrier. 2 bodies moved like puppets. Amina ran before her feet understood the command. She found Faraz wrapped in an ambulance blanket, blood the color of burnt coins on his forehead, and eyes that surprised her with an expression between guilt and something else. Perhaps at how quickly life could cancel plans. He had survived, miraculously, while a passenger, a man in a suit with a briefcase, had not. The news wrapped itself in wave after wave. The deceased had been a businessman with a string of debts, a name that would pull at the ears of Javid. Police lights painted the night blue and white. Javid's number called, then didn't. It left messages that tasted of sugar and danger. In the days that followed, Faraz's recovery was medical and spiritual. He had a limp that permanently rearranged how he walked, and a silence that felt like a place inside him where something had been taken out. Amina tended to him with the steady energy of someone who believed in slow recoveries. She stroked his forehead and told the children stories about mighty ants that carried the world in their mandibles. The man who died at Faraz's side was not a man with mere debts. He was a broker whose life was threaded into the city's undercurrents, contractors, developers, politicians. Javid began to avoid the house. Rumors attached themselves to Faraz. Men in suits came to the street and left like cocksured vultures. Money that had felt like new light became a magnet for dark things. One night, while the house held its fragile breath, Imam Sulaiman visited. He sat lightly as a prayer on the charpoy and placed his hands on Faraz's knees, like a doctor testing for pulse. The Imam had watched the family for years, through weddings, funerals, small triumphs, and his perspective was a patient river. He said nothing about the accident. He did not need to. Instead, he unrolled a small prayer sheet and asked for tea. The 3 of them sat in the lamplight while rain pattered a percussive rhythm on the roof. Dua. Imam began, his voice a soft chisel. Dua is not only what you ask for, it is what you become when you ask. Amina looked at him, puzzled. What do we become, Imam Sahib? You become a hand that lifts. You become an answer to someone's prayer, he said. You become honest in ways you did not know how to be. Imam Sulaiman told them about a gathering he wanted to hold. A small one in the masjid, not a spectacle. There is a man from Safa, he said. A reciter. He will play a Nasheed. Illahi main Tujhse dua Mangta Hoon. He has a way of turning words into wells. People come and bring their broken things. We will pray together. Amina's chest tightened. The Nasheed. The title felt like an echo of her own ledger, of all the daws she kept folded in her pockets. The melody, when Imam described it, was not a performance but a bridge. She found herself nodding. On the night of the gathering, the masjid smelled of lemons and oil. Lamps burned in a neat circle. People brought food, and the atmosphere was both dense and honest. The reciter, his voice a sober instrument, stood in the center and began with a phrase that opened up the room like a door. Words rose and folded over the congregation. Illahi, main Tujhse dua Mangta Hoon. The recitation pulled at the seams of people's lives, and the sound had wings. Amina sat with her hands folded, throat raw with things she had not given a shape. Faraz sat beside her, his body a map of bruises. Nasir was there, stooped but steady, and more people came, a shopkeeper whose daughter had left home, a widow whose son had been arrested, a young man addicted to the bottle. Each carried a small private hunger, and together they were a tide. The Nasheed did what songs do when they remember their origin. It made people honest. They began to stand and speak in fragments. A woman with eyes like peeled almonds whispered for her child's healing. A man asked God to relieve the shame of stolen goods. The reciter's voice braided their requests into one long, communal supplication. When the time came for Faraz to speak, he hesitated as if a seam had been sewn too tight. Then he stood, and the room became a lens. He spoke not of the cascade of money, but of the death by his side, of the passenger who had lain like a small bomb of unspoken debts. He spoke of the guilt that had soaked into his bones because he had wanted a life that looked different, and because, somewhere along that road, he had stopped noticing the faces he loved. He confessed, a small, luminous confession, that in his pursuit he had allowed others to be used, had accepted transfers without asking, had grown greedy. The words tasted like metal and honey at once. A hush gathered like cloth. Nasir's shoulders surged with a breath, a mix of grief, relief, and the weird joy of seeing a child unroll truth. Tears slipped down Amina's face quietly, hot and sanctified. The Nasheed rose again and coated Faraz's words like balm. Imam Suleiman held his hand, and the room became a place where the combination of confession and supplication made something new. After the gathering, Javid sent a message, a short line, "We'll talk." Faraz did not answer. The message hung like a thread in their small house, and the question of what to do next vibrated in everyone. Nasir, who had been almost a shadow most days, surprised them by taking a slow, decisive step. He walked to Javid's office, a place that arranged the city's fortunes like a tailor fits suits, and sat while the world tilted around him. Nasir had been a secret keeper once, or rather he'd been the man who had swallowed mistakes so his family could breathe. He remembered a time when a handshake mattered more than a permit. He had been a fixer for small neighborhoods, a man who knew where the city could be kind. But aging had layered him with quiet. He returned home from Javid's office with a battered envelope and a face that was both relieved and tired. Inside the envelope was a small amount of money and something heavier. A contract. Javid had offered Faraz a way out, but it required an exchange service for silence, loyalty for release. Javid liked to make people think of themselves as entrepreneurs so he could collect their debts with smiles. Nasir had refused. He had taken the envelope only to count it and to let the paper feel like a lie. The decision to fight back was patient and subtle. Imam Suleiman organized a meeting of shopkeepers, drivers, and small business owners. They pooled money, not to buy silence, but to fund a legal counsel, an advocate who could speak of rights and the law like a weapon made of words. They printed flyers and built a case. The city's power could crush them. It could also be the kind of city that answered when its small citizens shouted. Faraz, healed enough, applied for honest work again. He drove school children, his pride earned slowly. He put down the new phone and took an old one that displayed only necessary numbers. He started to coach a boy from the corner who had the speed in his legs and the hunger to use them for football. The boy's mother cried when Faraz returned home with milk and the boy's thanks. Small things added like prayers into a sack. One evening, the group confronted Javed in his office. They were not loud. They were exact. They had witnesses and a lawyer who had once been poor and refused to forget. Javed tried to fold them into arguments about efficiency, about the city's need for people like him. He offered money. He offered threats. But the community had become a church of small sentences. They quoted laws, they produced records, and, crucially, they produced witnesses who had seen Javed's methods. The businessman's veneer cracked with a series of little admissions, and when his suit no longer worked as armor, he offered an apology that tasted of ledger ink. It did not fix everything. There were fines and payments to make. There were men who did not mend their ways and left the city like birds who had lost their song. But there was also a restitution that allowed Faraz to pay debts honestly and began to repair trust. That was important, Amina thought, because trust was what her mother had left them in the form of small recipes and the habit of making tea for any neighbor. At the center of the small revolution had been Imam Suleiman's simple prescience. Dua was not just a petition, but a practice. The dua they raised in the masjid had become a scaffold for action. They had asked, and then used the hands they had been given to answer. Amina began to teach her students with a new line in her voice. She told them about courage that looked nothing like heroism, but everything like the choice to do the small, necessary things. Faraz and Amina found new ways to measure success. For Faraz, success was the boy he coached scoring a winning goal. It was Nasir laughing at a joke he made about a stubborn goat. It was Amina's eyes lighting when a child spoke the word respect, the way it had never sounded before. For Amina, the answer to her dua came not as a lottery jackpot, but as a community that refused to let her fall. She had always prayed for hands. She had not expected them to come as neighbors, teachers, and a reciter whose voice became a kind of map. The last scene that folded the story into a ribbon happened in winter, when the air was bright and sharp like a blade that had been cleaned. The masjid filled again, this time not because someone had died or needed conversion, but because people wanted to sing. It was a celebration of sorts, not extravagant, not flashy, but genuine. Faraz stood near the back, his hand tucked into Nasir's, and Imam Suleiman arranged the reciter in the center like a conductor preparing an orchestra. When the Nasheed began, it held a new meaning. Illahi, main Tujhse dua Mangta Hoon. The reciter sang, and the room breathed with the memory of confession and reparation. People whispered the parts that mattered to them, and the song turned into a reply, "We are your answer." Amina looked at the people around her and counted her blessings the way her father counted his tools. One by one. Hamid's mother was well again and came with a small tray of sweets to offer. The boy, who once had eyes that always searched, now held a cricket bat like a scepter. Nasir laughed with the loudness of someone who had found a child in his old bones. Faraz's hand tightened on his father's as if to anchor himself to the truth of that night. Afterward, as the lamps guttered and the city settled, Amina stood under the eaves and felt the air cool on her face. She lifted her hands without thinking. Not a recitation known by the book, but a private two-line prayer that had grown with her. "Thank you for the hands. Make me one of them." Her voice was a whisper, but the night accepted it like a promise. The city carried on its business of being loud and soft, generous and cruel. But in the small house on Myanmar Road, the ledger had been balanced not just with money, but with the heavier, truer kind of counting truth, reconciliation, and action. Faraz went out sometimes now to drive and sometimes to coach. He worked at the small garage of their neighbor, learning how to fix engines the way Nasir had fixed clocks, steady, with care. Imam Suleiman's lesson lingered in their household like a scent, a dua done, is not always an answer wrapped in gold. Sometimes it is the courage to say you were wrong and the choice to mend the wrong. Sometimes it is a community that refuses to let greed be the law. Amina taught her students to pray with hands that would do something, and she watched the small futures brightening like tin roofs in the sun. On a night when the moon threw its silver like an offering across the lane, Faraz came in with a packet wrapped in brown paper. Inside were keys, a modest car that had been bought with patched savings, and the restitution money. It was not an SUV, nor a promise of a life that glittered. It was honest metal and the smell of new upholstery. Faraz handed the keys to Amina, his grin a rueful half-moon. "For the school runs," he said. "For Hamid. For when the future looks uncertain again." There was something like apology in the way he spoke, and something like a vow. Amina laughed and cried until her face hurt. She clasped the keys as if they were a talisman and then set them on the ledger table where they would be a reminder of the difference between what you want and what you owe. Nasir clapped in a slow rhythm, proud as a bird who has returned with a branch. The dua that had started as a private whisper in Amina's chest had unfolded into many hands. It had become a community answer. When she closed her eyes that night, she saw the reciter's face, lit by a lamplight that made him look like a man who had carried many sorrows and turned them into songs. She heard her own voice lift in the room, small as it was, and in that tiny place she found a profound peace. Petitions, once spoken, can be the beginning of movement. Years later, when she taught a new class of children, Amina would tell a story about the night the city almost swallowed them and how it instead taught them to stand. She would not romanticize pain. She would treat it like a teacher who gives hard lessons. She would say, "Ask, yes, but be ready to become the answer." And the children would look at her with small, earnest faces and learn that prayer, in its best form, grows hands.